welcome to this edition of Talks at Google. I'm joined today by Ted Miguel. Ted, delighted to have you on the program with us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Ted is the professor of developmental economics at UC Berkeley here in the Bay Area. He's also the founder of Berkeley's Center for Effective Global Action, which was founded 15 years ago to improve the level of research that's informing work on alleviating poverty and helping with global development around the world. So, Ted, the title of today's talk is around the notion of open science and how open science can help with all those goals. Can you tell us a little bit more about what open science is?
For sure, Ken. It's great to be here and get a chance to share what we're doing. I got interested in international development very young. I'm from an immigrant family and traveled a lot and saw different parts of the world and wanted from a very early age to have a positive impact on global poverty. That was really something that's always driven me. And I went into the field of economics and development economics, committed to that goal. But what I found when I went into the field, I started as an undergrad at MIT studying math and economics. I found a field that wasn't very data-driven, wasn't very scientific in many ways. I found a field where a lot of decisions were really being driven by ideology more than hard evidence and data. And I made it my goal, and there were a bunch of us in the field at the time, young development economists, who made it our goal to bring in the best possible data, the best possible statistical methods to bring evidence into debates on global poverty. Such an important issue, and it deserves the best evidence. So we started using tools like randomized controlled trials. More recently, we've brought machine learning tools in and new sources of data, and started tackling some of the world's most important problems. At the same time that we were bringing in these new methods, we brought in a different kind of mindset. And in particular, we were very committed to ideals of open science and research transparency from the start. The idea is, if you generate evidence, you want to share it openly. You want to share it honestly. You don't want to be beholden to any one particular ideological agenda. You really want to follow the scientific ethos to the extent possible, and have faith that sharing data openly will lead to the best possible outcome. So early on, we combined this use of rigorous methods with open science ideals. And what that meant in practice for us was a commitment to sharing our data with other scholars, even at a time 20 years ago when that was really rare, and scholars in economics didn't typically do that. It also meant that when we generated evidence that was unexpected, or we generated null results, we made sure that those ended up getting published. So people may be familiar with the fact that in scientific publishing, there's often a concern about publication bias. Certain types of findings get published, maybe if they conform to existing paradigms, if they yield strongly significant results, but other results get lost. We were committed to publishing everything, sharing everything, regardless of whether the donors who funded it liked the results, whether or not governments liked the results, whether or not we had statistically significant results or not. And I think that combination of rigorous methods and an open science ideal has been part of the reason why the work has been so influential that we've done, and that I hope to talk about today.
Fantastic. And I have a few questions to follow up on that, but let me also invite people who are watching the live stream to add comments and questions, and we'll try and pick up as many of those as we can as we go along. So when you talk about the successes and failures, the null results and the significant results, can you give us a few examples of each? How is that proven out in practice?
Yeah, I'm delighted to do that. Let me start with a project that was really the first research project that I worked on, that I started in grad school, and that continues to the present day. And then I'll tell you about some of the other, the failures too. The first project I worked on was a school health project that I worked on in Kenya, together with my co-author, Michael Kramer, who's at UChicago now. We worked with a nonprofit, with an NGO that provided school-based treatment for intestinal worm infections. So it turns out that these intestinal parasites are very widespread. Billions of people around the world have had them, and they can lead to a range of negative nutritional and health consequences. Those are the bad parts about that disease. The good part is they're very easy to treat. There's really just a pill that kids need to take once or twice a year that costs less than $1 a year, that can clear the worms. and allow them to grow and possibly learn. But really, when we started the research, it was an open question what the broader impacts would be of these kinds of school health treatment. So we work with an NGO. As they scaled up the project over time, we work with them to randomize the order of the scale up. So eventually a whole region ended up getting deworming, but there were some schools that were randomly chosen to get the deworming pills first. And this was one of the first randomized control trials in development economics. We ended up comparing these early treatment and control groups outcomes over time, and we found some striking findings. So within a few months of receiving deworming treatment, kids who had gotten the drug started going to school more. They were healthier. The worms were effectively killed off in their body, and that allowed these kids to do better in terms of health and schooling. Because of those very promising early results, we ended up gathering, continuing to follow this sample over time and try to trace out what happened to their life outcomes even years later. What happens when you improve the health and human capital of poor children in a rural part of Africa? How does it improve their lives? And so for the last 25 years, we've actually been following up these individuals, thousands of them, to try to see what happened to their lives if you ended up getting more health investment and improved health in childhood. And we found some striking things. So in the long run, the kids that receive deworming drugs earn about 10% more in adulthood. 10% isn't going to transform these folks' lives to be as rich as Americans. But given that it's only $1 to get deworming treatment, there's an incredibly high rate of return on those investments. They're more likely to move to cities. They're more likely to get more schooling, and so on. So this was a project that, again, I've been working on for a long time. We've put a lot of effort into the measurement, the scientific measurement of all these outcomes. And we've shared the data publicly with the rest of the scientific community so that they can build on it, critique it, along the way. So this was a research success in the sense that we carried out one of the first randomized controlled trials in development, but it's also had a lot of policy impact. So from very early on, we presented these results to policymakers at the World Bank, the World Health Organization, many times in East Africa and Kenya, and policymakers became very interested in this intervention. If very cheaply you can improve the health and the lives and the education of children, it seemed like a good deal. And a movement really emerged globally to provide support for deworming programs around the world. So over the last decade, hundreds of millions of kids a year have been receiving deworming drugs. And a lot of those programs explicitly cite back to our research as part of the inspiration for those programs. So in India and Nigeria, in Pakistan and Ethiopia, in Kenya, there have been mass programs. So it's a project that we're really excited about because, as scholars, we try to collect the best data we can, do the best analysis we can, but to see the real world impact of that research has been really exciting.
No, that's fantastic. Now, one of the values of the research is to debunk myths in development, right? The things that people think should work, might work, but maybe don't work so well. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, for sure. I think when we when we started this work in development, and there was so little evidence on so many topics, it was easy to think that there were panaceas, or it was easy to think that maybe 10 different interventions could have huge impacts. When we've done the research, we've actually learned that it's harder to achieve change in the real world than you might think, and that's why the research is so valuable. We need to sort out where there's impact and where there isn't. So one particular project that I've worked on that has that kind of feature is work on rural electrification, also in Kenya, where I've done a lot of my research. So starting about 12, 13 years ago, the government of Kenya launched a major rural electrification effort. And in this, Kenya was a few years ahead of a lot of its neighbors who are only now kind of starting some of those programs. So Kenya was sort of an early adopter trying to push out rural electrification. And we forged contacts in the Kenya Power Company to do a randomized evaluation of this expansion. So we actually worked with them to, as they expanded, only certain villages got electrified first, others were going to get electrified later, to try to understand the impacts on the economy, on children's schooling, for instance. If you get electrification, you can maybe study at night, and so on. So we started this project with high hopes, really anticipating that it could be a transformative intervention. we collected data over multiple years in a randomized controlled trial, and we found something surprising. We found that all the different measures of economic outcomes, agricultural productivity, entrepreneurship, even schooling outcomes for kids showed null results. We did not document that there were positive gains to rural households in Kenya getting electrified. And at first we were puzzled, and certainly the partners in the Kenyan government were also a bit puzzled. They were putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into these programs. But as we did more research and collected data, survey data on the households, we figured out some of the reasons why. So what we found is the households that received free connections to the national grid very often didn't have any appliances. The median number of appliances was 0. Typically, they only had a light bulb and would sometimes use electricity to charge their phones. So if you can't afford appliances to use with electricity, it's not really going to do much for you. We were very hopeful at least there might be some gains in education. We collected detailed information on kids' schooling outcomes. We administered extra academic exams to children across, it was 150 different communities, so thousands of households in this area. And we also collected detailed time use data on the kids so we could really measure their study time and how it might have gone up now that they could study at night with electric light. And there we found something also surprising, although I think pretty interesting. We did actually find that kids in the treatment communities that got electricity studied about 20 minutes more every evening for school, but they also studied about 20 minutes less in the afternoon. So they ended up playing with their friends or going out and doing other things, and then sort of studying just before going to bed at night, and their test scores didn't change. So, overall, it really highlighted to me the value of doing this kind of rigorous research, publishing the results regardless of the findings, because we learn a lot. There's still a lot we don't know in international development. And yeah, the folks who funded our research and the Kenya Power Company may not have been thrilled that a lot of their investments weren't improving living standards in rural areas, but as part of our ethos in open science, we really owe it to the community to publish those data and make it clear what works and doesn't, so others can allocate their resources more effectively.
Or find alternative ways to run the program, like subsidizing the purchase of appliances or agricultural equipment or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Exactly right. And so, in contrast to what happened in Kenya, the US had a big rural electrification campaign about a century ago in the 1930s during the New Deal. And as they expanded electricity access in rural areas, they did actively subsidize appliance purchases for agriculture and non-agriculture. And then there were a lot of documented benefits. So, again, we can learn a lot about how to build on programs or maybe fund alternative things from rigorous research.
Now, there has been controversy over the years about RCTs, the randomista movement, all of that. A lot of the programs and some of those critiques are that that the RCTs can be too narrowly focused, just looking at direct benefits or not, and not looking over the long term, taking into account all the positive spillovers that might be there. Some of the programs you've talked about try to take that into account, but I've got to think it's also very expensive to look at this comprehensively and over a number of years, just tracking the participants and not. How do you see that challenge, and how is it playing out?
Yeah, you're exactly right on that. That from the start, there's been this debate, and it's a debate that's been very high profile in development economics and economics as a whole, between looking at very specific narrow interventions that may be amenable to RCTs versus, say, broader interventions or thinking about broader impacts. In our work, we've tried to do both. We've certainly looked at some very targeted interventions. At the same time, we found a lot of value from measuring broader effects. So I'll give you an example of a project I've been working on with Give Directly. So that's an NGO maybe some folks who are listening in know about. They provide direct cash transfers to poor folks around the world. We work with them in Kenya starting around 2013, 2014. We work with them to try to measure those broader spillovers that you talk about. There'd already been some research showing when you give households cash, those recipients benefit in various ways. That they eat more, they buy more clothes, so some sort of direct benefits. We designed a study together with Give Directly that was quite large scale. So it was more expensive than a typical study, in which we didn't only randomize at the household level or the village level where the cash went out, but as Give Directly was expanding, they actually randomized at higher levels of aggregation, what was called the sublocation in Kenya. So basically, certain local economies received lots of cash and others didn't. And this allowed us to understand some of those broader impacts, because in addition to surveying the households that got the cash, we surveyed their neighbors. We did a census of all local enterprises and we measured their revenue. And we also went to markets to measure prices. One of the concerns with cash transfers is if you throw a lot of cash into an area, there could be price inflation, for instance. So we designed a large-scale program to measure those things, and it proved to be very valuable, I think, not just for Give Directly, but for the whole evidence-based anti-poverty movement. We replicated existing studies by showing that if you get cash directly, you benefit in various ways. But we were able to measure the broader spillover. So it turns out when I get cash and I spend it in local businesses, we were able to measure how much those local businesses benefit. Their revenue goes up a lot. They start hiring more workers, including some workers from other households that didn't get the cash. So there are what economists would call multiplier effects. And we can quantify that. We actually find a multiplier effect of 2.5. For every dollar that goes in, there's $2.50 more economic activity in these areas. At the same time, we measured price inflation and found a little bit of price inflation, but it was quite minimal. So, overall, the gains were almost all real gains rather than nominal gains. So that's kind of in the weeds of this study, but it really showed the value of a well-designed RCT that thinks about broader impacts, because it turns out we were understating the benefits of cash transfers. It wasn't just a one-for-one benefit. There's this larger benefit for the whole community. And this is the sort of evidence that I think 10 or 15 years ago was impossible to collect. Before people were using RCTs, before we had the kind of data collection methods we have now, it was impossible. But now this is kind of the frontier of development economics research.
So coming out of a study like that, people debate whether direct cash transfers versus programmatic assistance, deworming, for example, are more effective. Where do you come out on that? How do you think about the problem?
I take a kind of both matter approach, and I would follow the evidence. So in cases where there's a lot of evidence that cash has benefits, it's clear we should go there. There are cases, though, where it's harder to measure all the spillover benefits, and that's a bigger challenge, I think, for policymakers and funders. Do they always just want to go where there's a lot of evidence, or should they think more broadly about systemic change in society? So there's a lot of interesting debates there. I do think the upside to what we're doing now is the evidence base is getting so much stronger, precisely because more and more studies are looking at these broader effects. So I do think the evidence base is stronger. When it comes to cash, versus other things, I'll tell you about some recent evidence on that, which I think suggests both matter. So as part of this Give Directly evaluation we've been doing in Kenya, we've been following up individuals in the study sample now for many years. And we've been tracking not just economic outcomes, but also health outcomes. So we've been taking a census of the whole area we're working in and tracking the number of births, and also tracking how many of those kids survive to age 1 to age 5. Unfortunately, in rural Kenya, child mortality rates remain quite high. So there's something like 40 out of 1,000 kids die before age 5. It turns out in the areas that received a lot of cash, those infant mortality rates fall dramatically by more than a third. So there is a broader spillover benefit, even just beyond the people that got cash. Their children are more likely to survive. But here's where there's an interesting twist between cash and other things. In some new analysis, we've actually found that those benefits in terms of child survival of giving out cash are largest by far in areas with access to a clinic nearby. So giving cash alone helps people, their nutrition improves, there are some benefits for child health. But if you give cash to households and they also have access to health services, you get a much larger benefit. So I think that really speaks to us having a more sophisticated view in international development and understanding the complementarities between, say, cash and other forms of public goods and other investments in driving positive change.
There have been a number of different proposals for programmatic assistance, ranging from microfinance to technology, the one laptop per child, et cetera. How do you think about the effectiveness of some of those interventions?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned a couple that have been very popular, that have gotten a lot of attention. And I think, a decade ago or 15 years ago, say when CEGA, the Center for Effective Global Action, was getting started, there was a lot of enthusiasm about, say, the potential for microfinance programs or one laptop per child to be really transformative. And maybe if we took a poll of those who are listening to this right now, and we asked them to raise their hands about, do they think these programs are likely to have a lot of impact? They might think they do. Those are both interventions that have been very well studied, microfinance and one laptop per child, in large-scale randomized controlled trials that have found pretty minimal benefits on average of those interventions. And I think those were surprising findings for a lot of people in the field, especially with all the enthusiasm and hype around those interventions. So, just to give people a reason why those, microfinance hasn't been as successful as we thought it might, it turns out most people aren't great entrepreneurs. If you give people microfinance, a small subset of them maybe start a really effective business. A lot of other people don't do as much, with that cash. So if you could target it very effectively, you might have more impact. But large scale microfinance programs have been shown to have near zero benefits in terms of local living standards. So I think this is exactly why the body of research, as it accumulates, becomes so effective at moving policy. And in both of those cases, the early research, some was produced out of CEGA, others through our partner organizations, have helped to move the needle on policy priorities and funding priorities.
We had one question come in, teeing off your earlier reference to machine learning early on. How are you seeing artificial intelligence, machine learning potentially benefiting some of these programs, tracking either on the research and tracking side or the effectiveness of the programs themselves?
I'm personally a big proponent and optimist about applications for machine learning in development. Our center at Berkeley, CEGA, has been one of the leaders, maybe because we're here in the Bay Area and there's such a strong CS community that we've collaborated with. The economists at CEGA have collaborated with. We've really started bringing these tools into our work in a serious way. And I'll give you an example of one recent project that CEGA funded during the pandemic. So my colleague, Josh Blumenstock at Berkeley, who's in the School of Information, was approached by the government of Togo at the start of the pandemic because they wanted to target cash transfers to poor Togolese during the crisis. We know there was a lot of documentation, a lot of studies showing that living standards collapsed in those early months with lockdowns. There were a lot of hungry families. The problem was the government of Togo didn't have the data to know who was poor. They hadn't done a census in many years. There wasn't high quality household data. And so they approached Josh and said, and the team at CEGA and said, what can we do? So Josh had been working for several years to use machine learning tools to measure poverty using alternative data sources, to predict who's poor, using cell phone records, using remote sensing data, using other forms of data to predict both local areas and individual households that were poor. Within a month or so, the team got together, implemented this algorithm, and predicted which several 100,000 households in Togo were the poorest. And the government, working with Give Directly, targeted cash transfers to them. So it was actually a great use case where having the right technology and having the real serious skills in machine learning, but also understanding the challenges of anti-poverty programming, combined, helped hundreds of thousands of households get cash transfers in a prompt way. And now that approach is being adopted in a number of other countries by Josh and other folks. So that's just one example of how machine learning tools can really help with anti-poverty programming. Another application would be other forms of targeting, like targeting people who are most likely to be the most successful entrepreneurs. Maybe that's a better way to target microfinance dollars. So personally, I think that the sky's the limit with applications of ML and AI tools in development.
We had a nice application here at Google. The Google.org team worked with Give Directly in the wake of a hurricane in Florida and here in the United States. And the combination of using satellite imagery to understand where the hurricane had hit and ML tools to understand the neediest areas resulted in the ability of the government to be, and Give Directly, to give funding to people in days rather than weeks. So they were getting the cash transfers when they needed it the most, when they were really in desperate circumstances. So we're seeing more and more of these great examples.
Yeah, that's great.
So tell us a little bit more about CEGA and the unique work that you're doing. There are a variety of different folks doing research here, but how do you see CEGA's mission in this?
Yeah, so CEGA, the Center for Effective Global Action, is based at Berkeley. We were founded at Berkeley, but now we span multiple campuses across up and down the West Coast. So, Stanford, we have a lot of affiliates at Stanford, UCSD, UCLA, University of Washington. In all, there's over 160 faculty affiliates and hundreds of grad students working on the kinds of projects that I've been talking about today. From the start of CEGA, there were a few things that set us apart from our partner centers, and we work closely with a number of other research centers in this space, and collaborate on projects and events. But there's a few things that set us apart. One is, from the start, we were interdisciplinary, and we brought in technologists, we brought in computer scientists, climate experts as CEGA affiliates, and we actively collaborate with them. So even though about 2/3 of us are economists like myself, there's a good chunk of CEGA affiliates in our network who are bringing in new technologies, new tools. And as I said, I think these are just very high potential. They have the potential to have a lot of impact. So that's one thing that sets us apart. Another one is we combine different methods, and I feel like our network has been very creative at bringing new tools in. So we were among the earliest to use randomized controlled trials in development, but more recently we've been among the first to bring in machine learning tools, new anti-poverty measures, et cetera. So we see ourselves as an innovator in this space because we're flexible methodologically and really want to bring in the best from data science, climate science, and other other approaches. A third thing I'll say, which I think again will interest some people listening, is we have a very strong commitment to fostering research by early stage researchers, both based at Berkeley and on our campuses here in California and on the West Coast, but also early stage researchers in low and middle income countries. So we've forged a lot of partnerships with institutions in East Africa, West Africa, Bangladesh, and basically forge collaborations between CEGA faculty and young scholars from around the world to provide training opportunities and research opportunities more broadly. So it's a very inclusive vision, and I think that inclusion, though, is very important for making sure that these ideals, tools, and research are really global, and will have more impact that way.
Now, I should mention, CEGA is a not-for-profit. You're open to, I'm sure, would welcome contributions from folks. Tell us a little bit about, as you're thinking about, if somebody is at home saying, boy, I think about an end-of-year charitable contribution, and it's either an intervention that's been proven to be successful over the years, or the research side. How do you weigh those two things against each other?
Well, first, I would say, for interventions that have been proven, if people are excited about that, that's a wonderful thing to give to. And I would say, certainly there's plenty of high return investments like deworming, cash transfers, and others. At the same time, there's a lot we don't know. So, our feeling right now is we've learned some things, we've identified some things that work, but there are lots of sectors, programs, countries that are almost unexplored at this point. There are billions of people living in low and middle income countries across scores and scores of countries. And what we're doing with our research is shedding light on more and more possible big wins. And if we hadn't done the research 20 years ago on deworming, we wouldn't know about that return now. If we hadn't done the research on Give Directly, we wouldn't have known about that. Same thing for anti-mosquito bed nets, et cetera. So even though we've learned a lot, there's still so much more to learn. And we feel like the pace of learning and evidence generation isn't slowing down. So I think for people who are thinking in a hard-headed way about rate of return and trying to really maximize their impact in the world, what you're doing by funding research is you're making an investment in making future giving much more effective. And so as long as we have time horizons that are sufficiently long, we're going to want to make those investments. So we keep identifying the wins for tomorrow, next year, and even 10 years from now. And so, again, I wouldn't want to dissuade people from giving to charities or nonprofits that are doing good today. That's incredibly important and inspiring. But there's still so much more we can learn.
So we have had another question come in that wants to go back to your analysis of the deworming example, one of your seminal pieces of research, and now there have been groups around working on a variety of similar topics. So Can you tell us a little bit more about the experience here? It's been going on for some time. Obviously, that was a unique, lengthy duration. What have you learned from the sample so far?
Yeah, I think there's a few really unique things about what we did there. From the start of that study, we put a lot of effort into getting contact information on people, address information, cell phone information as that emerged. And we've been very successful at tracking the participants in that original research over time. So we've actually been surveying folks from that original study now for over 25 years. That's a very long duration for any study. As far as we know, it's one of the longest longitudinal data collection projects in Africa that we're aware of. And we've managed to maintain very high tracking rates. So we've been in contact with about 88% of that sample over time. And so, usually we're very concerned about sample attrition. For people who are interested in the statistics here and kind of like the data issues, if you don't put in the effort in terms of contact information and frequent follow-up, you will lose sample and population over time. We send our research teams all over East Africa to survey people in person. When we can't reach them in person because maybe they've moved out of East Africa, we do phone surveys. And it's been a labor of love to collect that data over time, but it's really a unique data resource. And then, of course, the analysis has a lot more validity when we're really talking about something that's representative of almost 90% of the original population over time. So I think that's, the kind of data resource that, funding for CEGA, funding for this kind of research, enables.
Yeah. Some of the great stories I've heard of a group like Evidence Action that is working on deworming has now gotten support from major governments, including the government of India, to do not just pilot programs, but really scaling up different kinds of programs. Are there learnings from your work about how scaling up works well and doesn't? In some cases, there's always a worry that it may work well in one village, but not in another village 100 miles down the road for logistical reasons, cultural reasons, something else. How should governments be thinking about this work?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different issues around scaling. One is simply how to get governments to listen to begin with, and then there's the kind of external validity issue that you raised. We found in our work at CEGA that when we launch projects in partnership with governments and NGOs and really include them in the early discussions, they tend to be a very eager audience to learn the results of that research. And so that's one of the advantages of working within a center like CEGA. For me, as an individual researcher, is the center and center staff maintain lots of relationships with governments, foundations, and NGOs that can forge really useful research partnerships. So we're not just publishing into the void, but for instance, I mentioned the rural electrification project in Kenya. From the beginning of that project, we were having regular meetings with high-level government officials in Kenya. They knew about our progress. We kept sharing our data with them. So when we delivered these results, we were delivering them at a very high level, and then they could be acted upon. So I do feel like that's one of the advantages of a center that puts both research and policy action sort of at its heart, is they're very interested in making that connection. The second point you raised, Ken, I think is a very deep intellectual point about how do results travel from one setting to another. So in the case of deworming, the area we worked in Western Kenya 25 years ago had worm infection rates of over 90%. Basically, all the kids were infected. So that's a setting where you might expect deworming to have a big impact just because the health problem is so severe. If there were no worm infections, I wouldn't expect deworming to have much impact. So that's a kind of trivial example, but there's a lot in between. So with rural electrification, at what point are households rich enough to be able to afford appliances, where all of a sudden an electricity connection flips into being something profitable? Those are the kinds of things governments need to work with us on. Within our own data, we actually found in these rural Kenyan communities, we had enough sample that we could look for heterogeneity in the treatment effects of the program, variation in the treatment effect. We actually found that the richest, about 10 or 15% of the village, those households seemed to be gaining from getting electricity. They were buying appliances, they were starting businesses, but the other 90% were. And so the average effect was basically a null. But as Kenya continues to get rich, we can kind of project out how many people are in that income category and could benefit. So again, having enough data and the right kind of analysis can help governments do that planning over time.
How do you think of the not just the efficiency, but the equity impacts of some of this. You mentioned the top 10% may be benefiting more. Your earlier example of, do you look for the most promising entrepreneurs or the impacts on local businesses who may already be the more advantaged in those communities, but may also be in a position to spread the benefits more widely? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and you've put your finger on something very important. We wrote a paper on exactly this issue with electrification, saying, wait a minute, this is an intervention that, even though it's targeted to poor rural areas, in those areas is probably exacerbating inequality, at least in the short run. Now, maybe eventually everybody gets rich enough, and can benefit. Even with cash transfers, I mentioned the Give Directly study on cash transfers. One of the things we found is elderly households led by elderly people, households led by elderly widows, et cetera, don't seem to benefit as much from the cash transfers. They're not going to be starting businesses. They're not going to be making those investments. So over multiple years, one of the most disadvantaged groups isn't benefiting as much as we would hope, even from something like cash. So, this is something, again, data we've shared and data that I think is very important. Other types of interventions may be needed to help those populations. So again, instead of writing them off, we have to identify which interventions are exacerbating inequality and then design new interventions to make sure disadvantaged groups aren't doubly disadvantaged by an anti-poverty program.
There's so many preconceptions and intuitions and maybe even myths in this area. Is it better to give funding to female heads of household, male heads of household, grandparents who are heads of household, et cetera? Who's going to use the money the best? So the research feels as though it's very valuable in grounding that, at least and the answers may be different in different countries. Do you think about the answer in Kenya may be different than the answer in India?
Definitely. I've mainly worked in Africa for my research, both East Africa and some work in West Africa. But I did work on one project and did field work in India early in my career. And I was struck by the differences between, say, Kenya and, a Kenyan rural area and India, even around something related to gender norms, which you kind of put your finger on. There are very different gender cultural norms, religious norms, et cetera. So, this is the reason why, doing a study in one place is valuable, but we need to do research in the understudied countries, in the understudied regions as well. There is some meta research out there trying to correlate estimated treatment effects, again, to get into the nerdy statistics, but correlate the estimated treatment effects across different regions of the world for a certain intervention, like cash transfers or microfinance, et cetera. They are positively correlated. There is some signal. If you do an intervention in West Africa and you do it in Southeast Asia, you're likely to have a kind of related impact, but it's far from perfect. And that external validity question is exactly the reason why we need more studies in more countries, because the answers could really differ. And even across different parts of Kenya with different norms, there could be different answers.
Well, let's step back. I invite, if there are any other questions from the audience, would love to take those, but maybe give Ted you a chance to highlight some surprises that you found over the years, things that there were skepticism about that turned out to work, or we touched on some of the things that people had some belief in and turned out not to work. But what are the most interesting insights you've garnered in your years in the field?
Yeah, I think for me, there's both, policy lessons and then research lessons, as well. When I started working in development economics, as I mentioned, randomized controlled trials were a new thing. We carried out one of the first RCTs. We also were among the first to share our data. We were among the first to pre-register our hypotheses. There were all these open science practices, just to get back to the theme of the talk today, that were new and that, at first were different than what other economists did. What I've been impressed by, to answer your question, is just how quickly a lot of these, I would argue, better methods and improved methods have really spread in the field. So things that were really unusual 10 years ago or 15 years ago are commonplace in development economics. New methods, RCTs, new data sources. Economists are learning machine learning tools, registering pre-analysis plans. These are, it's unclear how scientific change happens, but in our field, it's happened really quickly. And I'm so excited about it because the quality of research and the credibility of research is just so much better today than it was 10, 20 years ago. So I would say that's a surprise. Early on when we presented experimental results and we had this deworming RCT, when I was just starting out as an assistant professor at Berkeley, we were often told, wait, this is an experiment. This isn't economics. And we thought, no, we can be scientific in economics. So I would say that's one big positive for sure. There have been a lot of research surprises, and I'll say, I mentioned rural electrification, but I can cite multiple other projects I've worked on where we went in with high hopes about real world policy impact or real world poverty reduction impact. And the truth is, there's a lot of programs that fail. There's a lot of null results out there. I worked on a project in Sierra Leone right after the Civil War ended for about 5 years that sought to reform local governments, to weaken the power of traditional chiefs, to empower women. And there was a whole methodology that the World Bank and partners implemented in Sierra Leonean villages to try to make them more democratic and inclusive. We carried out an RCT of this program, and we just found null result after null result. The traditional institutions were very persistent. Of course, we shared those results and we published that null result, even though it might have been disappointing to some. So I would say the combination of rigorous methods and a commitment to share the results, regardless of what we find, to make sure they're public, to be open about them, has been very powerful. But we should, temper our enthusiasm in the absence of evidence. A lot of things that sound promising, when we collect evidence on them, aren't as promising, and that's why we need to do this research.
Look, it's a great response to the reproducibility crisis to actually have more grounded analysis, more public analysis, more, as you say, pre-registering expected results, so you're not cherry picking from what an experiment happens to find after the fact. So that work is extraordinarily important, and obviously the openness of the development community and governments around the world to hearing about that research, building government programs in database to evidence ways is extraordinarily important. So let me just wrap up by thanking you for the work you're doing on the research side, but also in the field. I know you spent a lot of time in Africa and other countries around the world, helping some of the world's neediest people to actually improve their lives and become more empowered than they are. So it's tremendous work you're doing, CEGA's doing, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Ken. It's just been great to chat with you and have this conversation.